Hello, and welcome to our latest Somerford Associates Technology podcast. I'm Anne, and I'm your host for today. Every episode, we dive into a technology area that our clients, you, are grappling with. We explore the problems, discuss the solutions that we've seen work and have implemented, and look to the future to try and have a heads up about what problems we'll be dealing with tomorrow. Everyone I work with is in some way doing a cloud migration and dealing with managing multiple cloud environments. Most people will end up with a messy and wonderful blend of on-premise, SaaS, IaaS, and on private hosted clouds. And this will give us much more agility than we've had in the past. A more efficient operation, hopefully. You know, why do you need to know the back end of the app if a company will do that for you? And greater resilience to disasters. I'm sure there'll be a strong business case too, to having an MSP who helps with a smaller on-premise estate than doing everything and slowly. But what about securing this new setup? We no longer have the castle and moat simplicity. What about observability across the whole environment? If an app is performing slowly, and it is run on containers or not even on our estate, how do we get to the root of or the cause of the problem? So that's what we'll explore today. Cloud operations, the problems, some solutions, and where we hope to be in the future. So I welcome Baz Donahue, an esteemed colleague of mine and our cloud security guy. Welcome, Baz. Okay, well, welcome, Baz. Thank you for joining me.
No problem.
I was wondering, for the listeners, could you just give us a background of how you've come to be our cloud security expert in Somerford?
Yeah, absolutely. So prior to Somerford, so I've been at Somerford, I think, around 2 years now. So prior to Somerford, I was in Her Majesty's most modern Royal Air Force. I was there for 12 years. So I spent the first 6 essentially either flying around to various different destinations and setting up baseband systems or satellite communication stations and various other different sort of deployed comms platforms and technologies. And I spent kind of the latter half of the first 6 years building out IT systems, deployable IT systems, and various different supporting technologies. And then the last 6 years of that, of the 12 years, was spent at MOD Corsham. So I was part of the Joint Cyber Unit, initially as an analyst, so working quite closely with log analysis platforms and the various different teams, all through from kind of advanced log analysis through to malware and the various other supporting teams. So I've got a good overarching understanding of not just the tools and technologies and the various different techniques, but also the kind of policy side of life and how to build those out.
In an environment, I assume that security is probably one of the highest that you can find.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a really interesting environment to work in from that perspective because, absolutely, security was key, and actually managing various different, essentially, organizations' security platforms as well, and trying to understand what their visibility is, where the gaps in our visibility are, and kind of how to kind of plug those gaps was part and parcel of our day-to-day conversations, essentially.
So you were in the joint.
Yeah, pan government and MOD. So it was all about operate and defend. So there was an operational side and a defend side, and naturally the two are intrinsically linked. So we were kind of central to all of that. So in my final few years prior to joining, leaving and joining Somerford, I was in an area which dealt with innovation and exploitation. So that was really interesting in that we got the chance to play with lots of new shiny tools, assess their value and kind of what they brought from a capability perspective to the table, and then plan how we're going to integrate them into what we do at the moment. So it was all very useful experience, certainly for lots of challenges that we're seeing out there in the real world, as I call it, kind of outside of government and MOD, which of course are in the real world, but there you go.
But slightly different though. And so we're really lucky to have you from all of that experience. One of my favorite conversations with Baz, just for listeners, is when he can imagine what a naughty cyber hacker would do if they tried to get in. And I have no clue. I think if I got into a server, I'd be like, okay, don't know what to do next. But you're like, well, he'd tried to do this, she'd tried to do that,
Yeah, that was always fun. But I always say in defend, you've got to get used to being a loser because you never win. You're either always on par or behind. So you don't really win in defense. You've kind of just got to do what you can do to prevent the inevitable. Essentially, as long as you kind of look at it with that mindset, it kind of helps.
Okay.
It's easy. You don't get so overwhelmed. So.
That's a joyful message.
Well, it is and it isn't. I mean, it's just a fact. Unfortunately, it is a race, and you're racing against the aggressors essentially, to try and
and they have the incentive
to
innovate, right? So they'll be the ones who are ahead of it.
Yeah, I mean that's an entirely different podcast topic. I think right there is really good, interesting conversation we used to have about how we'll always be behind because we technically, from my perspective, have to play by the rules, and these threat groups don't. They've got access to other methods that we can't really play by those rules. So,
at the moment, everyone's going to be moving towards cloud, which I've kind of talked about in my introduction. Do you agree?
Yeah, no. So we've been seeing people, taking up more of a posture from a cloud-based perspective, certainly, for a number of years, actually. So, things like infrastructure as a service, everyone will be aware of sort of, AWS, GCP, Azure, those types of platforms. Those have been utilized for some time now. But there is much more of a focus on it very recently, obviously with COVID-19, where essentially people have had to be a lot more agile and make decisions in order to remain relevant and in order to continue trading. Essentially, they've had to make that jump into the cloud. So we've always kind of seen that migration happening, but we're seeing it at a significantly accelerated pace now.
They're not all going to be cloud native 100% or all going to have all their eggs in one IaaS basket. They'll kind of be a messy hybrid situation, probably.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think there's specific security challenges depending on exactly kind of which flavor they are. So if you're nascent and starting to adopt cloud, you'll have a certain set level of challenges. If you're hybrid, for example, one of the main challenges that we see with organizations taking a hybrid stance on cloud is that they probably already have quite well established on-premise security policies and various different security controls around the various different applications, processes, services that they provide. And one of the challenges is that they don't necessarily translate very well when it comes to working in a cloud environment. So, for example, working on premise in what we would call static infrastructure, you have a pretty well known boundary, you have a good perimeter, so you can establish trust based on where anything is with regards to that perimeter. So if it's external, it's low trust. Internal, it's high trust. And again, that might be further broken down by security control, such as network segregation, where you can further increase that trust. Whereas when you make the jump to various different cloud solutions, that's not necessarily the case. So with IaaS, it's in the cloud, and there are security policies and controls naturally, but the policy and procedure and kind of thought process don't necessarily map very nicely across.
Is that what the main problem is? It's like they are secure, obviously, but it's just you don't have that that policy that you used to be able to do because it was all in your organization. It has to sort of match into someone else's policy now.
Yeah, I mean, so one really good example, having worked in that static infrastructure world and being involved when the MOD went through their transformation to cloud, is that people are really well versed from a security perspective on how to identify security threats. So they have a good understanding of the various different signatures and the artifacts and what they might be. And a lot of them are based in IP. It's really, really easy to understand trust, on the face of it, based on IP, and you can put security controls in place to control those, like things that we see in a typical on-premise security stack, like your web application firewalls or network firewalls. So you can build rules into that. The problem is that those controls don't necessarily map across when you start to look at IaaS platforms who are providing various different services that you can't identify via IP alone, or the IP is so dynamic that it's nigh on impossible to do it. So you have to have some of the methodology for being able to control not just the communication between the various different moving parts of your cloud platform, but the integration and interaction of your static on-premise services and in the cloud. So that's where we're seeing things like Console, for example, HashiCorp Console, which builds up a service registry to understand what services are where, who they normally communicate to, and can then go on and utilize that information to build something like the secure service mesh, which then allows services to communicate with each other, not based on whose IP is who, but based on who they could normally communicate with and other rules, and typically trying to map your your IP policy to that type of policy is a step change in thought process. So that's where a lot of the challenges can arise, as an example.
That's really interesting. So that's saying that instead of just using IP as the kind of safe, not safe thing, and now we're more dynamic, and now that the IPs changed so much and they're outside of our control as well, we have to use a service registry.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and other things as well. So let's just take, for example, maybe there's an organization that has static infrastructure, and within that static infrastructure, they have a number of services. So maybe there's some databases, maybe there's some web front and back ends in there, or maybe maybe some data storage areas that they can that other than database they need to access. What they would typically do is allow communication to those either internally or externally based on IP. And we mentioned previously, maybe they've got some network segregation. But what can happen in many organizations is that by virtue of you being able to access that particular network segment, you basically have access to all the services in there, and your trust is implied. And that worked in the traditional environment because we had various different layers of security. So you had physical security as well. So when we make that jump to cloud, we don't have that physical security element anymore. So, it's much more difficult to ascertain trust and control it. So the old methodology.
That's why they're calling it zero trust, because you don't want to have someone can get into one of your edge apps or whatever and then suddenly get everything.
Yeah, absolutely. Old practices that, on the face of it, from a security perspective, are not particularly good, but people have been doing for years because they were mitigated by that physical security element. So, DB admins might leave some username and password credentials on the database, server itself as an emergency access to it if they need to backdoor in, or passwords and usernames might be utilized in the clear for various different configuration management systems, but again, mitigated by the fact that that management system was inside a perimeter and secured via the traditional means. Whereas you transfer that to cloud, and now, you don't want to be doing that because you can no longer establish that trust. So yeah, absolutely. Things like zero trust to ensure that people are only accessing those things that they're authorized and required to access, certainly mitigates elements of that kind of traversal across services based on access alone.
So what we're saying is that in the future, more people are going to be either 100% cloud or hybrid, more likely hybrid. And the challenges that we have in hybrid are stuff like we can't use our old ways of building trust, and we have to now do zero trust. Are there any other challenges when you're in a more of a hybrid cloud environment?
So there are some other challenges that they're not necessarily specific to hybrid. They probably encompass cloud first attitudes as well. And then there's some other kind of good examples of more prevalent challenges for people who are cloud native or going, diving straight into cloud first. So some challenges that encompass both is certainly visibility. So understanding the visibility of what your users are doing in the cloud-based environment. This is really prevalent when we talk about software as a service. So we're talking about SaaS. So IaaS has its own challenges, but SaaS, absolutely. And with the advent of remote working, this has only ever increased because people working, utilizing IT to be able to carry out whatever their day-to-day tasks are, they tend not to want to be hindered by IT. So what they'll do is if they don't have a solution that is native to their organization's policy and practice and how they've built that out, they'll look elsewhere for it. So if Teams isn't working, for example, or Teams isn't particularly well implemented within the organization and they need to share some documentation, they may be tempted to, some users may be tempted to Google, well, I need to share a PDF. Is there some sort of PDF sharer or PDF uploader or some sort of cloud storage that they can quickly utilize to just get the job done? And understanding having that visibility of what users are doing in the cloud is an absolute challenge.
I totally understand it from their
Yeah,
perspective, though, because when you're on a big project and you just need to get the job done,
of course.
you just go for whatever is easier, and you like water, you flow around on problems, but with probably very little regard to the security or the implications of what you've just done.
Of course, yeah, and it's not entirely like security personnel and IT personnel would like to point at the users and say, it's a user problem, and I don't believe that's the case. I think education has always been a key element to security, and having understanding of the threats and how to manage and mitigate those personally. But I think there's always been an issue. But the accelerated move towards more and more people working remotely has only compounded that. So one example is if you're working, previously you might be working in an office, again, static infrastructure, maybe there's some cloud-based applications you're also utilizing. What may happen is they might be previous organizations might be quite strict on the way that they imply rules. So a user might say, okay, well, I have a need for this tool. I know there is a tool out in the cloud. Somebody's told me about it. I've researched it, etc. Can I use that? And typically IT elements of an organization might say, no, that's not a sanctioned app. We're not going to utilize that. There's no sway. You can or you can't do it. You're just entirely blocked from accessing it. And when you're on premise, users will either have to like or utilize what's available to them and lump it, and because they don't really have any other choice. Whereas now they're working remotely, many of them do have the choice because, again, some of them may be using corporate devices, others may be bring your own device. So they do have that freedom to do it. And the idea there is rather than just giving, it's all around usability. So if we can make services, whether they're SaaS, IaaS, or whatever, really, really easy to use and take away a lot of the frustration and just allow the users to get on and do what they need to do, even if there's a little bit of risk, but we manage that risk by having being able to observe their activity. That is better than point blank blocking them, because then they're going to find a way to do it anyway, and now you've got no visibility of what they've done.
So what sort of tools give you visibility across that?
So there's various different tools. So let's talk about cloud access security brokers. So such as Netskope, obviously one of our partner products and organizations. So they provide that type of visibility. So not only that, so they give us the visibility of what users are accessing from a cloud environment. Now, a lot of people maybe listening might think, well, we kind of get that anyway from maybe web proxy logs, or maybe we've got some networking logs that can kind of tell us where our users are going. One of the problems that we've seen with the traditional security stack with those types of WAF applications are that, they can tell you that. So they could tell you that, bazs went to OneDrive, but because of the way that a lot of SaaS applications now are encoded and the way that they operate, a lot of the activity is encoded in the URL. So we can tell somebody went to OneDrive, but we can't tell what instance they went to OneDrive, because everybody goes to the same instance. On the URL, it looks like everybody goes to the same instance. The actual instance that they went to and the activities that they carried out and on which objects is all encoded as part of the URL. And typically, you can't see that on the old type of WAF applications. On Netskope, they have next generation type stuff that they can do that. So not only can you tell if bazs went to OneDrive, you can tell which instance was it. Was it my personal OneDrive? Was it my corporate OneDrive? Was it a third party that we're sharing with? And exactly what I did. Now, you don't have to enforce any of that, but having the ability to observe it and understand it is a massive advantage.
Yeah, it'd be great for the CTO and the technology people who would be like, they could see a demand for a different product or a need if they see that kind of instance growing. Like Baz always goes on OneDrive. Are our sharing mechanisms good enough? What's been happening? Why is he doing that?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, you can understand what your user base is doing and what they're utilizing from a SaaS application perspective. And then again, use something like the Cloud Confidence Index provided with Netskope to go, okay, well, we can see that they're using OneDrive. How does OneDrive actually shape up as a service? Because with the Cloud Confidence Index that Netskope provide, essentially is a score. So it looks at your SaaS application and scores it. And this is done on various different elements, all the way through to what types of encryption do they utilize? If they do encryption, which keys do they utilize and which types of algorithm, all the way through to costing and whether or not, a big one for me is whether or not you own the data. So one really interesting thing you can see from the CCI is who owns the data. And if you look at some really low scoring applications, of course, I'm not going to name any, but some that are they're typically scored out of 100. So if you look at the really low end, so 20 and below, which are often these, convert web documents to PDF or convert anything to PDF that you might Google, we see that actually, if as soon as you do that, the information and the data is owned by the company that you send that data to. It isn't owned by you anymore. And once it's owned by them, they can do what they like with it.
That's I'm sure I've used a PDF editor thing in the
Yeah.
past. So
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
need to get on top of that.
Yeah, and I'm not saying they're always bad. You just got to understand what it is that you're utilizing it for. If it's something that's potentially sensitive, then it's not a great idea.
That's very user focused, but there's other challenges from the from people in the more developer roles and the IT roles within in companies. In that, like you were hinting that sometimes you might put username and password in free text, deep in the back end of a database or something. But
yeah,
that sort of habit, has to change. And what kind of tools help with that? Even in your personal life, the number of usernames and passwords and secrets and things that you have to keep, it's just loads. I can imagine in even a very simple organization, you'd have tons.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, for the reasons we mentioned previously, it's not really viable to kind of keep those credentials local anymore, in some sort of hidden directory, or even have them collectively offline, because that's not going to give us some of the agility that we need, and it just isn't viable within cloud solutions. So yeah, absolutely, there are a number of different solutions. Again, looking at HashiCorp, we're looking at a product like Vault. So Vault, on the face of it, when people have a look at Vault, they probably only primarily initially see secret management. Okay, and by secret management, what we're saying is let's take all of anything that we would consider a secret, so a username and password combination, maybe it's a certificate, maybe some sort of API key, and let's collect all of those into a single area. But what we'll do then is as opposed to just letting people have access to those, we won't. We'll have someone broker that access for us. So we'll have Vault manage that. So rather than have a user go to an area, put in some more credentials and unlock it, actually we can just say, that this particular individual is allowed to have access to this particular platform or this particular product, and all of that's managed by the secret management side of Vault. So you don't actually have to give anybody any keys. That's all managed and obfuscated away from the developers. So it's one less thing they have to worry about. There's again a couple of interesting things from Vault that probably maybe aren't quite so apparent. So they also do something called key lifecycle management. So again, where we've got various different API keys or various different other keys, we can actually have Vault manage that for us, so it can rotate them in and out. So this is really useful if we're looking at automated services. So we may have service accounts that do lots of work on our behalf. And those service accounts may well need to interact with various different SaaS applications or various different elements of infrastructure as a service. And what tends to happen is we'll build a key. Maybe we'll build some sort of key that's used for these service accounts, and we'll have to manually manage that key. But actually, with key lifecycle management from Vault, for example, you can actually have Vault issue a key as and when a service needs to use it. And as soon as it's done what it needs to do, it revokes the key, so that there is no overhang on that, right? It only has access to the key for as long as it needs it, and then that key is no longer relevant. And it can do this very dynamically. Again, if we're doing it in this manner, and maybe we have 40, 50 services, typically they're all going to use the same key. So if in a non-Vault environment, a typical developer environment, sometimes that's something we see. Now, if that key gets compromised, then we've also have compromise across the entirety of that suite. Whereas with something like key lifecycle management, even if one gets compromised, we can log into Vault, we can say that was compromised, roll it, and we'll instantly get control back of that instance, and all the other are covered off because we know that their keys are managed elsewhere. It's not the same key, and it's only going to be used when needed. So that's something that's really useful.
That is so useful. Yeah, so all of this stuff is just the way that you have to manage things in the cloud. It sounds like you just have to be a bit more automated, a bit more agile as well. So you don't have like some permanent place that you put things. They're rolling around. They're updating, they're changing.
I think the community from cloud automation has massively embraced it. Absolutely. And there are various different other products, infrastructure as code and all various different automated configuration management and various different repository solutions that people use. And I think the developer community have no problems with that whatsoever. I think it's ideal to a lot of them. The problem is the security concerns need to follow. So we need to have automated processes to be able to carry out our security operations as well. We also need to do it in a way that does not impair or infringe upon the developer's ability to develop and do what they need to do. So, security is always seen as a barrier, but I think with the cloud-based technologies, there's an opportunity for actually not to be seen as a barrier, but as a supporting force,
like an enabler, really, just
Absolutely.
to do it safer and just make all of that faff, like secrets and things, is not what people go into development for.
No, it's not fun. I mean, take encryption.
Config management. Oh,
yeah, encryption's one, right? So with various different cloud services, people naturally encryption is something that is absolutely integral to the security because we want to encrypt where we can, encrypt in transit, encrypt at rest. However, developers potentially have to develop that encryption methodology themselves. So they'll have to build the keys. They may have to utilize various different other like supporting processes to do that encryption. Again, with Vault, this was new to me, by the way, until I kind of got understanding of it. They actually offer something which is considered encryption as a service. So rather than any developers having to kind of come up with their own plan to how we're going to encrypt, what type of algorithms are we going to do, we can just say, Vault, I need you to encrypt this for me, and it will encrypt it and decrypt it. All you have to do is run the Vault commands to do so, and it does it intrinsically for you.
So you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time you want to do something that you do all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. You can standardize it.
So I've been jotting down the cloud challenges and then the tools that we need. We've got this sort of zero trust.
Yeah, zero trust remote access. So that's an interesting one, and again is something that's offered from a Netskope perspective, but it is heavily supported by identity access management solutions. Okta for identity access management. I think there's some elements of Centrify. I know they do privileged access management, but that's one element of it as well. So that they all leverage in nicely with being able to access identity management essentially.
They get clever as well. So like again, in that thing where the cloud world is very changeable and movable.
Yes.
People's risk or a user's risk can also change and develop. So, if you trusted Anne one week, if I start to go on dodgy websites and start to work out how best to sell Google's things like how best to sell information from my corporate account, I'll start to be a little bit more risky.
I see what you're getting at. So, so this is kind of where we start to look at interleaving the various different technologies. So a lot of the customers, they have a lot of these technologies in place. They've done their research. They've maybe picked the best in breed for a particular type of technology that covers off a particular area. They sit there, they configure them, and they utilize them. But often what we see is there's so much more value to be garnered by having them interoperate and having them look after kind of scenarios that you wouldn't typically expect them to be able to do. So one example, which kind of you were alluding to from kind of like a lifecycle management perspective, and I am from a Vault perspective, is so one really interesting thing is let's have a look at end users. So lots of end users have moved into the cloud, and one of the problems is again, many times people they haven't had the agility to be able to build out a strategy for providing everybody with a corporate laptop. So people are bringing their own devices. Now, we still want people who bring their own devices to be able to access our corporate knowledge base and our corporate assets and data, but we need to do it in a way that's controlled. And IAM is one way of doing that. But typically, what IAM will allow you to do is we can determine whether or not someone can access various different solutions from one authentication, from one credential, essentially. But one of the problems we see is, how do we enforce a particular user? So if we harken back to the OneDrive instance, so we can set somebody up with some IAM, we can set somebody up with, let's say, OneDrive, and we can say, okay, well, if you're going to access corporate OneDrive, the only way for you to access that is through our IAM solution. But what that doesn't do is stop the user going off and accessing their own instance of OneDrive by not logging into their IAM solution. Okay, so one of the things we can consider there is reverse proxy. So from a Netskope perspective, again available with the CASB solutions, I'm sure, but from a Netskope perspective, we can set up reverse proxy, and what that means is that we can only allow people to access a particular platform if they authenticate versus IAM. So if they try to, every time they try to access a non-corporate version of IAM or a personal instance, they're redirected back to say, no, you have to authenticate via IAM, and that will only let you into the corporate instance. Now, what this implies, though, from a Netskope perspective and from many other technologies, is that you need some sort of agent on the box to understand exactly what that user's doing. Now, I would be the same as many other people, and I don't particularly want an agent of my organization on my own laptop. I like to use my own laptop for my own things, but what we can do is give them an option. So one of the things we talk about, which is really useful use case, certainly when we look at both Netskope and Okta, is we can do enforcement. So we can say, okay, if you want to access our organization's data, you want to access our organization's resources, then you have to authenticate using IAM. When you authenticate using IAM, we'll let you into our instance, right? But what we can do is give them restricted access. So we can say, okay, if you're on your own device where we have a limited amount of visibility, then when you access it via IAM, you're going to access your OneDrive or whatever it's going to be, then you can only read. You can't download, you can't upload, you can maybe only view things. Now, lots of users might say, okay, well, that's not enough for me. I need to upload, I need to download, and I need to continue with my productivity. Well, then what you can do is prompt them to say, okay, well, we'll give you an option. If you need to do that, you can do it, but you have to let Okta install a Netskope agent for you. And as soon as you do that, the Netskope agent gets installed, we have full visibility, and it unlocks the ability for you to be able to do all these extra capabilities on that platform. Now, we're not enforcing it on users. They have the option. And if they can work in a reduced capacity without having to install the agent, then they will. But if they need to, the choice is theirs for them to install that and have access to it. So that's a lot more healthy arrangement between the user and the technology to give them the choice of having that visibility of what they're up to.
It's just lots of tools to think about. And is there an equivalent from the old days when you were all on-prem? Do all of these same use cases are just dealt with in a different way?
Very good question. Yeah, so some of them are and some of them aren't. And there's a sharp rise in various different new types of technology. And I think sometimes the technology name doesn't necessarily describe very well what it does. And what the need is. So that's obviously something that, as part of our cloud security strategy, we're aiming to do, is to demystify these technology types, because a lot of them on the face of them are maybe open to interpretation, and again, a lot of them have been adopted by the community and mean something completely different. So if we take observability as an example, so observability to me is something that people have been doing for years. I don't see how it's any different. But the concept of observability and how it's been adopted by the community is actually something quite different, and it means something a little bit more different, and it's something that SignalFX takes into account. So I've been doing log analysis and worked in the log analysis world, and to me that was observability. But the concept of observability means something else to different people, and again, the community has kind of standardized what that meaning is. So being able to understand what that is and demystifying it, I think, is really important.
Oh, it's really important, especially if I'm not a CTO of an organization, but one of the main things I would do if I were to look at all the solutions that I'm using and see where my use cases and where their capabilities are overlapping. try and consolidate a lot, which is bound to be cheaper, but also it might actually simplify our operations as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what tools do you reckon kind of bind all of these together, can make everything work in a nice mesh?
I think the value of those has evolved massively, and I think there's almost a tipping point that many different CM solutions have kind of engaged. So if we talk about back in the day of on-prem solutions from maybe a log analysis platform or CM solutions, typically we're talking about logging, right? So we're trying to get as many different log events from as many different sources as possible in theory. In practice, we actually only really want to pull in the information that we've deemed is going to be valuable to us, because typically there's limitations on how much we can ingest, either if that's physical storage or licensing, for example, depending on the model. We don't really, I want to boil the ocean because I'm greedy and I want everything, but it's not practical within various different organizations.
And is this also your kind of bandwidth as well as security analysts?
Yeah, of course. You want all the data available so that you can do as much analysis as you need to and enrich events and where you need to. But that's not necessarily always viable. But yeah, in the day we would ingest as many things as we could, and that was perfectly fine because we had. We could consider that as the visibility. We would build use cases, and we would either build use cases around the data that was available to us, or if we were really lucky and the data was all available to us, we can decide which use cases were valuable to us and cherry pick the different data sources that we need and consume them in your typical kind of CM solution way. But with the advent of cloud technology, what we're seeing is complexity is through the roof. So we have a look at an IaaS platform. Let's take AWS. There's so many moving parts. There's so many things you can log with AWS, and there's so much information that you can garner. It's almost at the point, in my opinion, where it's almost untenable to ingest all of that data natively in a raw form into a log analysis platform, into a CM solution, and then expect to be able to normalize it in a succinct way and then carry out security operations on it. It's just far too complex. Many organizations have tried, some with success and some without, but you can end up just drowning in information, especially if you don't have really well articulated use cases and understand all the user stories behind those.
There's also like they have all of their own terminology for the different types of log, but then you probably also have Azure and some other type of cloud platform, and then you have to be expert in so much more terminology to try and normalize all that. It's a headache.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've already previously mentioned that shift in culture and the way that things are being named. So you might be an absolute wizard when it comes to using signature analysis and understanding IP and working with network traffic and flow. But then when you start to look at CloudTrail and CloudWatch or the various different Azure logs available and all the other logging that all the various other different SaaS solutions and IaaS platforms give you, it's difficult to understand, because you kind of know what the platform's doing, but the inner workings are almost obfuscated from you, and you kind of have to bring out your own meaning. So what we're seeing here is a rise in, rather than logging everything with our CM solution and taking in things natively, put solutions in place that do a job and then monitor the output of that job in our CM. So the CM's not doing the heavy lifting as much anymore. Instead, the tools that are natively built to do it are doing it, and they're reporting back to us and giving us that single pane of glass view in a collective way, which we can then take an action. So again, example here might be, I'll use Netskope as another example. It just does so much. So another example Netskope does, so cloud security posture. So really, really important. So people have taken a running jump into the cloud, and I absolutely don't blame them. But they've done it at pace, and often security is, unfortunately, something that's a bit of an afterthought because we just need to be productive. People will come back and revisit it, and then they're in a situation where maybe they've they've given access to lots of people within their IaaS solution, they've built lots of instances, and they've configured lots of things in there, and then maybe not entirely sure of the state. So something like Netskope, where they do cloud security posture, is it will automatically scan your cloud security instance and report back based on not just giving you an inventory of what you have, how many EC2 instances, what VPCs you have, all your different IAM users, but it can take all of the configurations therein and apply them to good practice and to various different standards, and then report on where you're not compliant.
And then your CM just takes the report, right?
Yeah, your CM monitors all of the things that your different tools are reporting on and provides them in a single pane of glass view for an analyst or whomever is observing that to then get the overarching view. So one thing we're doing is they're not having to swivel chair between various different technologies, and they're also not having to trawl through mass amounts of events and understand what they are from, let's just say, an AWS perspective. Netskope's going to do that for us. Yes, of course, there are key use cases where we want to ingest the logs natively and we'll build up use cases. I'm not arguing that, but some of the other stuff, so when it comes to visibility and posture, there are other tools out there to let us do that. So again, let's take Vault. Vault's going to manage all of our secrets for us. So do we need to have all of the native events from the platforms that those secrets are being managed on? No, we can just have a look at Vault. It doesn't hurt to have the others to help support security cases if we need to have an investigation, but we want to have a single conjoined view and just try and have as much information succinctly available to us to make decisions as possible. I think on the face of it, and this is something we certainly used to come across in innovation exploitation quite a lot, is on the face of it, sometimes looking at products, building a product yourself using maybe some, open source software. Let's take old school Elastic Stack, or the Elk Stack as it was known. You could pretty much build a log analysis platform for only the cost of the tin that you have available. And that's how it was seen. And on some management levels, that's exactly how it was seen. So they would say, why are we paying X amount for Splunk when we can just do the same thing with the Elk Stack, pretty much, and it costs way less. Unfortunately, the problem there is, and you've alluded to it, is that actually there's a significant higher amount of man hours needed to configure an Elk Stack. You need very specific knowledge on the various different tools that it's made up of, the various different services, and each one is slightly different, and you'd have to have really good in-depth understanding of those. So actually the overhead of having the experienced and trained personnel to be able to operate an open source platform actually might end up in the long run being more expensive than just purchasing something that which is off the shelf but much more supported.
Yeah, well, so if I was employing you, Baz, in that position, if you were spending all your time trying to maintain that help solution rather than actually trying to keep on top of the threats, which are always growing,
yeah,
it's almost like a no-brainer that you'd outsource the more administrative sort of stuff, so that you can have your creative brain on security, which is what you employ for. And so it's almost like this whole cloud thing is just laziness, isn't it? We're all just outsourcing away. We're outsourcing the tin, as you call it. We're outsourcing the skills.
I prefer to think of it as working smarter, not harder.
That's a better way of putting it. Thank you, Baz. Yes, that is a better way of thinking it.
Yeah,
we'll have to tell the people editing to rewind that bit.
No. It is a point, but yeah, it's they always come up with. Lazy developers are sometimes the most innovative ones. And that's kind of the point, right? That's what we want. Innovation. So, but no, absolutely. So that's an issue.
So, okay, I think we've covered an awful lot of what the challenges people will have, and we've name dropped a lot of solutions that will help, and how putting them together can give you a much better outcome as well.
Absolutely.
So that's really fantastic. And can you give us a hint of what the trends will be in the future? So we've just talked about what people are experiencing now and the challenges they're doing now. Have you got an idea about what will be coming along the way tomorrow?
Oh, interesting question. Now, if I knew 100%, I would be a very rich man, because I would be way ahead of the curve and I'd know exactly which technologies to invest in. But what I do see is a lot of the activity that we've discussed. So, customers who've adopted the cloud, they've been in the cloud for a little while now, maybe not years, but months, and that's enough to learn. So what I am seeing a trend of is organizations having a good look at their security posture, both from how they kind of knew the old world on premise and how they are maybe now straddling potentially, hybrid cloud or maybe, cloud first. So lots of organizations are looking at that security posture and deciding where the gaps in that, where the gaps are in that posture and their visibility.
So they're having just taking a breath and taking a look at their security.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think being able, the organizations that make it really, really clear and really succinctly describe exactly what their product can do and how it supports you, I think they're going to come off key really. So yeah, there's lots of really, really good technologies, and there's many technologies that, they have a certain USP, but there are others that there are many that are on the same spectrum and they provide the same kind of capability. So I think where we're going to see organizations getting ahead is those that can describe exactly why their product is valuable and have a support wrap around that. So in showing value, one of the many elements we've been involved in is providing value. So again, I've mentioned them a few times, but CASB solutions absolutely going to be critical moving forward. Just purely for cloud visibility, if nothing else, but the various other myriad of elements in there. And I think, those security posture as well. So visibility over your IaaS solution and how that's being built is going to be is absolutely key. I think a lot of organizations probably already have CM solutions or log analysis solutions. So again, they're still going to feature, but it's all about their integration at this point. So how well do they integrate with these new technologies?
How well do they get to that single pane of glass sort of situation?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of it, though, is I think it's probably, 50-50 might be optimistic, but there's a lot of incumbent on the customers as well, on the organizations. There's some work there to really understand what their security policies are going to be and where they want to be from a security perspective and build out those use cases. The organizations that are going to do best are people who consider that and build out those use cases up front so that they can instantly be able to understand where a technology is going to be of value and where they can interleave those.
Yeah, it's exciting. Well, thank you so much, Baz, and it was really lovely to chat to you.
No worries, my pleasure.
This is an exciting time in tech. The benefits of the cloud operating model are huge: agility, cost, and with that blend of solutions Baz described, which are better together, I can see a way to do this securely and with the observability and control you had in the past. If you're listening and you want to find out more, please reach out to me on LinkedIn and Monday, or to Somerford Associates as a whole by emailing marketing@somerfordassociates.com. I can get you in touch with one of our experts like Baz to discuss your unique situation. We have regular webinars with our solutions, high level and extremely techie too. So if you have a browse on somerfordassociates.com/events, you might find some that's interesting to you. But if you have any other topics that are missing, just reach out and we're happy to help. So until next time, from me, Anne at Somerford Associates, and from the Somerford Tech podcast team, goodbye.